Welcome to this week's episode of Insight. During this week's show, we're going to cover three topics. The first one is going to be the sentencing, the illegal sentencings of one of the Armenian POWs held in the dungeons of Baku. Then we're going to move on to the latest information that we have on the U.S.-Armenian military exercises that happened last month. And then we're going to close with some comments on Armenia's recognition of Palestinian statehood. A few weeks ago, a gentleman named Rashid Balayan, who's 62 years old and a resident of Artsakh, who was kidnapped by the Azeri regime on August 2nd of 2023, was sentenced to a 15-year prison term based on fabricated charges. Apparently, Mr. Beglaryan made the mistake of walking from the unoccupied parts of Artsakh to the occupied parts of Artsakh last year before being arrested by the regime. All of this is absurd in the face of it. This is just man is a civilian that has really nothing to do with anything, and it tells you a lot more about the treachery of the regime in Baku more than anything else. What is news here is not an Armenian being railroaded in some nonsensical case in Baku, essentially being guilty of being an Armenian. What is interesting here is a lack of response on the side of this government. After the sentencing, I looked for an official response of any kind from our foreign ministry, people associated with her, and there was nothing of the kind. This is a disgrace. You have a completely innocent Armenian essentially given a life sentence, one of the worst regimes in the world, and the response is nothing. This speaks of the greater approach and the attitude of our current government towards the POWs being held in the dungeons of Baku, people, most famous of them being Ruben Vartanyan. And I think there's an operative logic behind their silence, and that is that if they push too aggressively to talk about these illegally held POWs and prisoners, that this is somehow going to disrupt or be used as an excuse by the regime in Baku not to quote-unquote sign the phony peace agreement. The reality is that there's not going to be a peace agreement, and I think people in our MFA and the highest level of our government know that. We are at best headed towards a period of a cold peace. Peace that we know will only be made possible by continuing to strengthen our defensive capacities. And more importantly, and as importantly, the very systematic criminalization, delegitimization, and the marginalization of the regime in Baku. The illegally held Armenian POWs in the dungeons of Baku are actually a weapon to use in the smash mouth politics of destroying the regime's image around the world. On a corollary note on this topic, according to the regime in Baku, they somehow invited Armenia, or actually the Armenian foreign minister, to come to the COP29 meeting, which is the UN Climate Summit meeting in November in Baku. We're not actually sure this invitation is actually correct because there's apparently some technical reasons involved that this invitation actually did not happen, but let's just assume it does happen. The reason that they're doing so is to be able to tell the world that this is, quote unquote, a peace summit, which is what they've talked about, making COP29 a peace summit. But what they really want is for an Armenian, prominent Armenian elected official or appointed official to be in Baku drinking champagne with all these international guests while Armenian prisoners are being tortured in the dungeons of Baku. I am not against, for example, Mr. Mirzoyan going to Baku, but there should be only one conditionality. Yes, let's make this a COP29, a peace summit, but I will come there only if on my flight back, I'm taking back all of the POWs. Otherwise, this whole thing is nothing more than a farce. Let's move on to the second topic of the week, which was the much talked about U.S. Armenian military exercises that were held in Armenia last month. First, I'm going to start by reading the statement put out by the U.S. European Command, and it goes as, Eagle Partner is designed to increase the interoperability between the United States and Armenia during peacekeeping and stability operations. The reality is that the statement likely hides more than it actually reveals, which is actually quite typical of these kinds of statements. These exercises had almost nothing to do with peacekeeping operations. These exercises are on paper supposedly being held by the Kansas National Guard, who are there as a partner of Armenia's for many, many years on similar trainings that were going on before. Everything was upgraded in these relationships over the past 2 years. But in reality, from what we understand, the people who were here doing these exercises was U.S. Rangers and Special Forces, along with the Kansas National Guard and others. What we also know is that this year's exercises were dramatically larger than last year's. Interesting of note, the same time period that this was going to happen is the same time period that the United States actually canceled similar exercises they've been holding for Georgia for many, many years. And this has to do with the deterioration of U.S.-Georgian relations. And most importantly, what came out of this is immediately after these exercises, while were going on, it was announced that there's going to be a permanent mission of a U.S. personnel that's going to be permanently stationed in our Ministry of Defense as an advisor in the reform process of our military forces. Moving on to the final topic of the week, which is the Armenia's recognition of Palestinian statehood. A couple of weeks ago, the Armenian Foreign Ministry announced that Armenia is joining other European countries in recognizing Palestinian statehood. This actually became big international news. The reason that the Armenian Foreign Ministry gave is because Armenia supports a two-state solution to create long-term peace between Jews and Palestinians living in Israel and Palestine, which is essentially the standard world position shared by the majority of countries in the world. They were joined by what seemed to be a very coordinated attack on whatever passes for Azeri media, attributing this recognition to anti-Semitism in Armenia, which is obviously absurd on the face of it. There was a very coordinated response by many different Arab countries, a very positive one to this, and even that seems coordinated given that how quickly they came and what sources they were coming from. In analyzing this, there's a few things that probably led to this. We're not sure. We don't have 100% confirmation of these things, but we can look at the possibilities. One of them that there's an Iran factor here. Since the signing of the strategic partnership between the United States and Iran, I think there's a level of unhappiness in the Iranian government, and this recognition is actually a small give to the Iranian side. And where this actually matters is in consistent delivery of Indian weapons that need to come through Iran, which the Iranians are always under pressure by the Russians to delay these deliveries to us consistently because they want to see us weak and vulnerable. So there's always this dance with the Iranian side. This could also be our government telling the world that we have agency on these matters, both to our friends and our foes. What's interesting to me here is that Armenia's recognition of the Palestinian state had actually got far more press than other countries doing so. And I think there's actually a reason for that, because I think given our history, our voice on such matters actually carries more weight than similar other countries in Europe. The second part that was interesting to me is the very specific messaging that came out of the Israeli state and her allies on pushing back on Armenia's recognition of Palestinian statehood. And if you actually go through it, they're making the case that essentially, how can a nation that suffered a genocide, like the Armenians did, reward Hamas for its October 7th atrocities in Israel by rewarding them with this recognition? Now, obviously, we know what we're saying is actually not the case. This actually brings me back to a corollary. During the illegal invasion of Artsakh in 2020, Israel actually offered aid to Armenian refugees, which our government, our prime minister, rejected, saying, essentially, how can the people that have suffered the Holocaust enable a genocide in Artsakh? And when he said those things, what we heard from the Israeli side was complete silence, and I suspect that's what they're going to hear from our side about their complaints. In conclusion on this particular topic, I will not list the dozens of reasons that the complaints of the Israeli state fall on deaf ears in Armenia. I would just tell our Israeli friends that we have 120,000 reasons to ignore their complaints on this particular issue. Thank you for joining me in this week's episode of Insights.
من چشم خویشتن دیدم نگاهم میرود سرخی رخسارم از دنبال یارم میرود من گرفتارم به طوفان در دل دریای عشق یار من با کشتی نو از کنارم میرود وای که چه حالی دارم